The lecture today by introducing Interim President Dr. Howard Cohen, who will begin our lecture today.
Thank you, though if anybody thinks that I'm going to be lecturing, the answer is no, I'm not. I do want to welcome all of you here and just say how tickled I am to see this great crowd to help us kick off Year of the Teacher. I think it's really fitting for Buffalo State that we are celebrating the Year of the Teacher in 2013-2014. Of course, you know our heritage as a normal school. Teacher education is really in our DNA. We have a commitment here at Buffalo State College to putting students first, and I think that that's really important as we think about teachers and teaching. And of course, we have a rich program array that has its roots and its breadth really in a teacher education beginning. It's a well-rounded education that comes out of a teaching institution. I think today teachers, and particularly urban public school teachers, work in an environment that I at least would want to call embattled. The dream of every child to be successful in their learning and to graduate from high school seems to be elusive and maybe a little bit at odds with reality. But despite that, government officials, business leaders, policymakers, parents insist that failure is not an option. They expect schools and teachers to deliver education and to deliver high school graduates, and they don't want any excuses. There's a well-known moral maxim from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who says that he who wills the ends also wills the means. The idea is pretty straightforward. If you have a goal and you want to achieve it, you have to be willing to commit yourself to the means necessary to doing so. And I worry a bit that our business leaders and government officials and policymakers and parents are not always willing to face up to the fact that you do need to will the means if you're going to will the ends. But we're very fortunate today to have Pedro Noguera speak with us. His work is research-based and culturally sensitive, and I think that he is a voice of reason in a world of posture. So we're going to have our dean, Wendy Patterson, introduce Professor Noguera.
Dr. Pedro Noguera, the Peter L. Agnew Professor of Education at New York University, is a sociologist whose well-known and highly respected scholarship and research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. Dr. Noguera holds faculty appointments in the Departments of Teaching and Learning and Humanities and Social Sciences at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Development. He also serves as an affiliated faculty member in NYU's Department of Sociology. Dr. Noguera is the executive director of the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education and the co-director of the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Education, and the co-director of the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Education in Metropolitan Settings. From 2008 to 2011, he was an appointee of the Governor of New York to the State University of New York Board of Trustees. Dr. Noguera received his bachelor's degree in sociology and history with a teaching credential from Brown University in 1981, his master's degree in sociology from Brown in 1982, and his doctorate in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley in 1989. He was a classroom teacher in public schools in Providence, Rhode Island, and Oakland, California, and continues to work with schools nationally and internationally as a researcher and advisor. He has held tenured faculty appointments at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where he was named the Judith K. Diamond Professor of Communities and Schools at the University of California, Berkeley, where he was also the director of the Institute for the Study of Social Change. Dr. Noguera has published over 150 research articles, or is that 151 with your most recent one in the nation, monographs and research reports on topics such as urban school reform, conditions that promote student achievement, the role of education in community development, youth violence, and race and ethnic relations in American society. Dr. Noguera is the author of 5 books. Dr. Noguera appears as a regular commentator on educational issues on CNN, MSNBC, National Public Radio, and other national news outlets. He has been honored from 3 different colleges with honorary doctorates. His short biography lists well-deserved awards too numerous to elaborate here. I personally can think of no one better to kick off our year of focus on teachers and teaching, which by definition must include close attention to learners and learning. To facilitate the many questions that I'm sure the audience will have, we have passed out note cards for you to write your questions. As Dr. Noguera delivers his address, you may want to write down a question at any time, and you may pass your card to the aisle where my assistants will collect the cards. At 1:15, my assistants will provide the questions to Dr. Noguera for his consideration. Hopefully, we'll have so many questions that he can't possibly answer them all in 15 minutes, but we will collect them so that he can have some time to think about the questions and respond to them later. So, again, thank you all for coming to help us kick off this wonderful year of the teacher. Without further ado, I give you one of the most exciting, insightful, and provocative educational leaders of our time, Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Good afternoon. It is truly a pleasure to be here. I want to thank President Cohen and Dean Patterson for inviting me after that introduction. I can only disappoint you now. But it's great to be here on this late summer day, which feels like fall is already here in Buffalo, and great to be with you. I want to spend my time today talking about what it would really take to transform our schools. And I do so acknowledging that we've been trying to reform schools for some time now. And despite these efforts, our schools don't seem to be making the progress, at least that our policymakers claim. I would say part of that is because we confuse real work of changing schools with slogans and issuing slogans. And the slogans change from time to time, but the real issues facing our schools haven't changed that much. And I want to talk about those today. I don't hesitate from speaking out about what I see as being wrong with the approach we've taken by our policymakers. I do that both because I'm a tenured professor, so I have security of employment, but also because, to me, this is critically an issue of justice. And the fact that we are not educating our kids in a country as wealthy and powerful as ours says a lot more to do with our character and values as a nation than it does about those children. And so I want to ask you for the next 45 minutes to try to work with me and think with me about why it is that we don't have great schools for all kids in this country and what gets in the way of that. And I want to start by acknowledging that part of what's wrong is the policies we pursue. Now, you just heard from Dean Patterson. I just today, if you look at The Nation magazine, it's available online, you'll see an article I just wrote about the Common Core, because it fits a pattern that we've seen for many years now, which is to think that there's a silver bullet solution and that if we just do that, everything will work itself out. And anybody who's been following this for a while knows that before the Common Core, there was No Child Left Behind or Race for the Top in between, and phonics, and we can go on and on. Every few years, it's something new that's been proposed by the policymakers. What's interesting is they never even acknowledge when they come up with a new one that the last one didn't work, right? and clearly something's wrong with this, and part of what's wrong I would argue, is that we are focusing on addressing symptoms of problems rather than the causes. Right? And as we should know from other areas where we focus on symptoms like health, if you focus on a symptom but don't address the underlying causes, right? A person comes in with a bellyache and you give them Tums, but in fact they have a bleeding ulcer or worse, you might in fact make it worse because you're disguising the problem. And I would say for a long time we haven't really addressed what's at the root of our problems in our schools, which have much more to do with poverty and inequality than with teachers. It's not to say that there isn't room for lots of improvement throughout the system. But I would say that we haven't yet begun to address what's at the core of what's plaguing our schools. I was on a panel not long ago in Texas, and I was about to deliver an address on the dropout problem. And just before I was to speak, the commissioner of education in Texas was going to speak. And we were chatting, and she said she was nervous. I said, "Why are you nervous? I'm sure you speak all the time." She said, "I'm not nervous about this group." So I have to leave here and go to the state legislature. And they're going to tell me they want a 0% dropout rate. I said, "They want 0%? She said, "That's what they tell me. And they're going to hold up my budget unless I promise them that." I said, "Well, why don't you tell them you want 0% of the kids coming to school hungry in Texas? And 0% of the kids coming to school sick, right?" She said, "You think I can get away with that?" I said, "I don't know, I'm not from Texas." But the fact of the matter is you don't have to be a rocket scientist or even the commissioner to know hungry kids don't do so well in school. And hunger is an issue throughout this country. Poverty rates have risen during this great recession, right? Just over 1/5 of all children in this country are poor, and we need to think about that because what does that mean? It means that lots of kids are coming to school with unmet basic needs. Health, housing, supportive families, all the things that Abraham Maslow once called the hierarchy of human needs. And at the base of that hierarchy, the things that our children need to develop. And as Maslow pointed out back then, if you don't have those needs met, you often don't experience healthy human development. Well, lo and behold, the kids most likely to drop out of school, the kids whose test scores are down in the gutter, the kids and the schools that are failing disproportionately are serving the poorest children. And we shouldn't be surprised to know this because we've known for the longest time that the strongest predictor for how well a child will do in school is how much money the family earns. And if you combine how much money the family earns with how much education the parents had, particularly the education of the mother, because the mother is typically a child's first teacher, you can predict with great consistency how well a child will do in school. Now, some people will hear that and say, well, he sounds like he's making excuses for why poor children aren't learning. So let me be clear and say this. Poverty is not a learning disability. We have lots of evidence that poor kids can learn. However, when you ignore the issues related to poverty that impact child development, poverty can become a disabling condition. Some of those kids who are struggling with reading need eyeglasses. Some of those kids who have trouble concentrating haven't had a meal or don't have a stable place to live. To ignore those issues and think that we can improve schools just by applying more pressure is to ignore everything we've known from our research on child development and school performance for the last 50 years. But that's exactly what we're doing. In the name of policy, we think that pressure and fear will produce change in outcomes. I see absolutely no evidence that this is working. We publish the names of the schools that are failing, put them in the paper, and you know about that in Buffalo, because you get more than your share of press. The state of Florida decided to put letter grades on schools to let everybody know which one was a failing school. So you can go to Florida and find F schools. Now, I would think that if the state puts an F on the building, the state should be sued if it allows children to go there. but they actually think they've done something by labeling the school. Be like if you knew this building was condemned because of asbestos. I'm not saying it is, but if it were and the president still allowed us to meet here, that would not be right, would it? So I visited Edison High School in Miami. It's a triple F school. And I asked the principal, how do you get to be a triple F school? He said, well, you simply fail the state exam 3 years in a row. I said, what happens if you fail again? He said, we will fail again because 85% of these children don't speak English, and there's no way they can pass a test in English because they just arrived. And this time the state says, if we fail again, they will take us over. So then I asked, well, are you worried about being taken over? He says, not at all. I said, why not? He said, well, first of all, I'm quitting this job at the end of the year. And you should know everyone I met described this principal as dedicated, hardworking, but he was tired. He was tired of being beaten down, tired of being blamed. He said, this crazy thing about this is the state can't take us over because there are too many schools just like us. Schools that have been failing for years. He says, what's more, do you think the state of Florida would know what to do if they took us over? Do you think they've been holding back on some special recipe for schools like ours? This is the farce that we call school reform today, where we use the threat of takeovers and pressure and humiliation as a strategy. And commissioners and governors and chancellors stand up and blame and point fingers, never at all suggesting what should be done to change outcomes. Pointing fingers is not a strategy any more than it is to try to think pressure will get us out of it. And if we think that simply raising the standards is going to change it, then we really are fooling ourselves. I've been advocating with several other researchers and policymakers and educators across the country now for what we call a broader and bolder approach to reform. We initiated this call just prior to the presidential election in 2008 in the hope that we could influence the debate about the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. And we said at the minimum, we've got to do three things in this next administration. First, we've got to expand access to early childhood education. Because everyone knows the achievement gap doesn't begin at 5, it begins at birth. And if we don't provide equal access to high-quality early childhood education, we should not expect to see kids catching up or making greater progress, because in fact, the countries that are outperforming us all have universal access to high-quality preschool. So second, we've got to expand learning time. Got to give kids more time. We got to look at summer, we got to look at Saturdays, we got to look at after school, because some kids simply need more. Not more school, more learning time. Middle-class kids get more learning time. Read The Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and he documents all the different ways in which affluent children get enhanced learning opportunities in the summer and after school, and poor kids get shortchanged. So we've got to try to level that playing field just in terms of access. And third, we said we've got to expand health care for children. Now, adults would be great too, but at least for children, let's make sure that we are addressing the health needs of kids because, in fact, that impacts learning. Now, we didn't think these ideas were that controversial. We thought they were all research-based. And we had a long list of signatories. In fact, one of the people who signed the letter was Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan. Well, no sooner had our letter to the editor in the New York Times and the Washington Post come out, 2 weeks later, another letter came out, challenging ours. And this one was drafted by a group that called the Educational Equity Project, headed by former Chancellor Joel Klein of New York City, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, and the Reverend Al Sharpton. Odd combination, I thought. And they said, no, this is not about those issues of health care and learning. This is about standards and accountability. We've got to stay the course. And anyone who says that poverty is an issue is making excuses. Now, Arne Duncan signed that letter too. Now, what's interesting about this is we find ourselves in this debate, but it's a lopsided debate. Because all the policymakers, for the most part, are lined up in that camp. And I would add, so is a good portion of the media, and lots of people in hedge funds and banks who are funding a broader change strategy which is resulting in the dismantling of public education in many parts of this country. And if that sounds like an exaggeration, then you've not been paying attention to what's happening in Philadelphia and Chicago and New York City. New York City alone has closed over 140 schools under Michael Bloomberg's leadership. Chicago's closing 50 schools this year. And the people closing those schools claim they're doing this in the name of reform. Now, I challenge, and I'm one of the few people in New York City willing to challenge Michael Bloomberg about the use of school closure as a reform strategy, because in fact, many of the schools they've closed were started under his leadership. And my challenge is, job of the mayor, especially a mayor who wants control of the schools, is to make schools better. Where's the evidence that schools are getting better, particularly for the children who've been least well served? Wrote an op-ed, said that many of the schools they closed were designed to fail. We said that they had deliberately over-enrolled some of the neediest and most disadvantaged students in certain schools, and then deliberately staffed them with the least experienced and least effective staff. And so, not surprising, those schools failed. And they said, oh, he's lying, he's exaggerating, and lo and behold, another study was done. They didn't release this to the public, but by a group called Parthenon that found exactly that to be the case, that all the schools that were failing had way too many special ed students, way too many English language learners, way too many kids coming in at level 1, right, in the 9th grade. Now, I also pointed out, if we had ended social promotion, which is something they claimed, right, because they claimed that they were going to end social promotion and they were going to retain all the kids who could not perform in the 8th grade, then why do we still have kids coming into school in the 9th grade at a level 1? Well, it's largely because we pretend that we're addressing these issues rather than actually looking closely at what is happening in our schools. And that pattern is repeated not just in New York City, but as I said, in major cities all across the country. One of the cities that I think deserves the most attention is Chicago, because former Secretary Duncan was once the superintendent there. And many of the ideas that are now being launched to guide federal policy were first tried out in Chicago, like the school closures. There was a very important study done in Chicago under his leadership by the University of Chicago and the Consortium on School Improvement. And they analyzed 10 years of school reform under Arne Duncan. Their question is, how come certain schools got better and other schools didn't? And what they find out is the schools that were serving the truly disadvantaged children didn't get better because they got no more resources. They also find that unless you have certain basic ingredients in place, instructional leadership, a plan for guiding teachers, a culture that supports learning, parental involvement, good leadership, schools don't improve. Now, none of those sound like things you've never heard of, do they? Sound like the basics. Except that none of our reform policies are designed to ensure that schools get those things. Because, as I said before, we are using pressure as a strategy rather than capacity building. And if you look at the schools that are making the greatest progress, what you find is a different strategy in place. So part of what I would argue that we've got to do is start to begin to develop a much more holistic policy than we have. That is one that includes a focus on health, on parent engagement, on community, on what's happening outside of schools. One that starts from a basic premise that we've got to understand who we serve in order to know how to meet their needs. And when I say who we serve, I mean, how do they learn? What do they care about? How do we excite them? How do we engage them? What are their needs? How do we work with their parents? Many of the schools I work with right now that are struggling can't answer those basic questions about their students, and it shows. Brockton High School can answer it. Brockton High School is the largest high school in the state of Massachusetts, over 4,000 students. They decided back in 2000 to take a different strategy because, like lots of schools across Massachusetts that were faced with the prospects of taking their high-stakes exam, they knew that over 50% of their kids couldn't pass because they'd come into high school reading at the 3rd and 4th grade level. And unlike lots of other schools across Massachusetts, when faced with that pressure, decided to do test preparation. And guess what? Test preparation doesn't teach you how to read if you can't read. Right? Group of teachers at Brockton decided, you know what we got to do? We got to teach these kids to read. And they went to the principal there, Sue Satchowitz, and said, you know what? We've got to make sure that every teacher at Brockton High School is a teacher of literacy, regardless of what they teach. And the principal said, well, that's a great idea, but I can't make them do it. I can't even pay them to do it. She said, we will lead it. Veteran teachers said, we will lead this effort to train our colleagues. She said, well, when are you going to do it? She said, we'll do it before school, we'll do it after school, we'll do it at lunchtime, we'll do it whenever they're ready. And it was a voluntary effort. And not everybody got on board. Some teachers said, no, I don't teach literacy, I teach science, or I teach music, or PE, I definitely don't teach literacy. But they got critical mass, and by 2002, when the high-stakes exams were implemented, and everybody, I think, knows by now that Massachusetts is the highest-performing state in the country. Over 60% of the kids passed. Now, what's interesting about that is, in places like Boston and Springfield and lots of other urban areas, that was not the case. Kids were failing in droves, and the state was declaring victory for high standards. A lot like New York now. But at Brockton, something else happened. The teachers who hadn't gotten on board said, you know what, maybe this literacy thing worked. And so more teachers decided they would get trained on how to teach their kids, regardless of what subject they taught. So by 2006, 80% of the kids passed. By 2010, over 90% of the kids passed. By 2012, 96% of their kids passed. 1/3 of the seniors got the highest possible score, got level 4, which qualified them for the full scholarship to any public university in Massachusetts. If you look at that picture, it's hard to tell from far away. 1/3 African American, 1/3 Hispanic, the other third low-income white students, because they're all low-income in Brockton. Brockton didn't find a shortcut. Brockton decided they were going to really spend time figuring out what are the needs of these students, how do we serve those needs. I got a call from Principal Sue Satchowitz last January. She said, I'm leaving the school, I'm retiring, I'm going to go do consulting. And I said, well, what's going to happen? She said, nothing. I said, because everybody at the school knows exactly what we've done, so I'm not worried at all. This last year, over 1/3 of their seniors also got Adams scholarships. Now, I would think the whole country should be asking, what's Brockton doing? Why don't we do more of what Brockton's doing? Now, Massachusetts, give them some credit, decided, hey, maybe we need to learn from Brockton. So the current commissioner of education in Massachusetts was the former superintendent in Brockton. So Massachusetts deserves some credit, unlike some other states. Then there are places like PS 28. Now, those of you who know New York City know we have some fancy names for our schools down there. And PS 28 stands for Public School 28, and it's in Bedford-Stuyvesant, section of Brooklyn. And I was asked by Sadie Silva, who's featured in that picture from the Daily News, she said, Pedro, please come visit my school. I want you to come and see what we're doing at my school. So it's hard to get out there. It's deep in Brooklyn. But I get out there, and she's there, and she says, I want you to meet my secretary. She said, he's the person who does all the administrative work. And I said, I'm so glad to meet her. I said, well, then what do you do if you're doing, she's doing all the administrative work? She says, I'm the lead teacher. She said, I didn't become a principal to escape the classroom. I said, come on, let's go visit some classrooms. So we go into classrooms, and the first thing I notice is every classroom we go into has 4 and 5 adults. I said, where are you getting all these teachers from? She said, they're not all teachers. So that one's the regular teacher, that one's the special ed teacher, because almost 30% of our students are special ed students with IEPs. So they have a push-in program with special ed teachers working together with teachers. I said, well, who are the others? She said, those are parents that we train to work with teachers. And every classroom has parents who are volunteers, they don't get paid, volunteer to work with teachers. And they do everything from make copies to work one-on-one with students. I see one parent, she's standing very close to a little boy. I said, why is she so close to that little boy? She said, well, she's there to keep him calm. And we're glad she's here today. See a little boy raise his hand, teacher just looks at him and nods. He gets up out of his seat, go to the bathroom. I'm curious, because in a lot of schools, going to the bathroom is a major issue. But he's back within a few minutes at his desk working. So I say to Sadie, I said, I'm impressed. She said, what's that? I said, I don't see any guards, I don't see any monitors. The boy went to the bathroom, came back. She laughed. She said, my kids have to walk on the most dangerous streets in New York City. She said, if I can't teach them to use the bathroom responsibly, I have failed as a principal. She explains to me that the secret to her success as a school are the partnerships she's built. She has a partnership with Downstate Medical School, with whom she wrote a grant to bring a dentist once a month, optometrist once a month. Children get the immunizations on site. It's a full-service school. She has another partnership with the YMCA. They run the after-school program, so kids get after-school help. They get chess, they get robotics, they get swimming lessons on Thursdays. School stays open every night till 6 o'clock because 40% of her students are homeless. 40%. And she said the shelter doesn't open up till 6 o'clock, and she doesn't want her kids on the streets in the cold. She has another partnership with a job training agency. They provide parents who wanted GED classes, job training classes on how to be a nurse's aide or security guard, English classes for parents whose first language is not English. I said, what made you decide to do this? She said, if my parents are educated and employed, they'll do a better job with their children. So I'm struck by the beauty of the school because it's a beautiful, immaculate building with art and even plants in the hallway. Plants in the hallway. She said, let me introduce you to my guidance counselor. She said, but I got to warn you, I got him from the rubber room. Now, those of you not from New York City may have never heard of the rubber room, but the rubber room was this place where they used to put teachers and others who had been written up for some infraction, and you could be in the rubber room for sometimes years, collecting a check, but not ever engaging kids. You could do crossword puzzles or yoga, but you're not going to teach a student. So I say, how did you know to get this man from the rubber room? She said, well, I don't know why he was there in the first place, but he was my guidance counselor when I was in school. And he literally saved my life. So when I heard he was there, I asked for him. They said, you could have him. And now he's at my school. And so we go into his office, and there's the counselor with the little boy. The little boy's about 8 years old. I introduced myself to both of them. I asked the little boy, why are you here? He said, well, I'm here to learn how to be good. I said, is it working? He says, I hope so, because I'm tired of getting put out of class. And then they explained, this is a school with a no suspension policy. They don't believe sending kids home to watch television is an effective form of discipline. So they really do spend time helping kids to learn how to be responsible for their actions. They focus on character development and keeping kids connected to learning. So we leave there. I said, Sadie, I'm really impressed by what you're doing here. I'm going to tell the chancellor, Joel Klein, he was still there, about what I've seen. She said, well, if you're going to contact the chancellor, I got to show you one more thing. So she takes me to her office, and I notice her office is set up like a classroom with a big table and chairs. I said, what's going on here? She said, I told you I was the lead teacher. So I'm working with kids all day long that the teachers that have trouble with. Then she says, I want to show you my data system. And she shows me that she's monitoring every single student in the school. They know exactly where they are. And there are portfolios with their work. She said, and a parent comes and asks me what their child's doing, I can show them what they're doing. I can show them what they need to work on. Nothing is left to chance. Everything is deliberate. So I leave there and I send an email to Klein and I say, you need to go visit Piers 28 because they're doing some extraordinary things there. And 2 days later he goes. And he's also impressed. So impressed that he sends out a memo to every principal in New York City. That's 1,800 principals. Describing his visit to PS 28, except he only mentions the data system. Because he was so pleased to see someone using it, because New York City just spent $100 million on that data system. He's glad to see someone use it. So I write back to Klein, I said, well, I'm glad you visited, but you missed it. Because it's not just the data system that makes that school work. It's all those things that come together that make it possible for a school like that, with that population, to get the highest gains in literacy and math in 2012. That's why they were in the Daily News. I'm not going to say that poverty is not an issue, but at PS 28, what they're doing is they are mitigating the effects of poverty. They're not ignoring it. They understand that kids will come with extra issues. One of the things I witnessed was a professional development workshop for teachers run by 2 social workers on how to respond to the social and emotional needs of children. And the teachers are posing questions. One teacher says, I've got a kid with attachment issues. Another one has a kid who's aggressive, who's fighting. Another one's got a kid who's depressed. And I'm listening to the conversation. I turned to Sadie, I said, what made you to offer this as a form of professional development for your teachers? She said, until I did, my teachers were referring too many of my kids to special education. She said, my kids have high needs. Therefore, my teachers have to be more skilled to work here. This is a leader who understands who she serves. It's also a leader who's not waiting for help. She's not waiting for the chancellor to come and say, what do you need? Or the governor or the commissioner. She knows they ain't coming. She's making it happen. She's going out into her community and building partnerships. Now, she's lucky because she lives in New York City. But she lives in a part of New York City that is not exactly where the big corporations and banks are located. They're not in Bed-Stuy. But she's resourceful, and it's rooted in a vision that focuses on how to make sure we are responding to the needs of these kids so they can experience not just healthy development, but intellectual growth. And over again, when you go to schools like Brockton High School, PS 28, you see a vision like this. A vision that has teaching and learning at the center of what they're doing. So they understand teaching and learning are linked. They're focused on learning outcomes for kids. Teachers are collaborating, they're sharing, they're talking about what their work is look like. They're accepting responsibility, they're not blaming kids or parents. But they're also focused on issues like safety, because they understand no one learns in an unsafe environment. And if the environment is unsafe outside of school, that's going to affect whether or not kids come to school. And they're focused on mentorship, because they know that some kids don't have 2 parents at home. And some kids don't have anybody looking out for them. And every child needs to have some adult who is looking out for their interest. And they're focused on parents and building partnerships with parents and meeting parents more than halfway so that parents feel respected and feel welcome, and parents are able to be advocates for their own children. And they're focused on nutrition. And they're focused on all the other needs that we know are so essential, because you can't ignore those needs. Now again, this takes money, doesn't it? But there are schools like PS 28 which don't have what Jeffrey Canada has in the Harlem Children's Zone. And I admire Jeffrey because Jeffrey's a visionary, but Jeffrey's raised over $170 million in Central Harlem. Not many people can do that. But PS 28 is showing you can do that. She doesn't have access to Goldman Sachs or any hedge funds. She's doing it by tapping into her community. What can we tap into right here in Buffalo to support our schools and to support our children? There is a debate going on around the country. Some say it's a debate about privatization versus the status quo. I describe it as a debate between the narrow view and the bolder view. The narrow view wants us to focus narrowly on achievement as measured by test scores. What does that do? It makes teachers focus on test preparation. And so I'm increasingly going to schools where anything that's not on the test is taken away from children. Right? Art's not on the test, take away art. Music's never on the test. So you see music's going. Phys ed, recess, at a time when obesity is the #1 health challenge. We see schools taking those away for double period literacy, double period math. I saw a study say that eating lunch was good for test scores, and I said, thank God. Or they might take lunch. Kids need a well-rounded education. Okay? And those schools that have adopted this bolder approach are focused on the conditions that support good teaching and learning. The narrow approach wants to use test scores to rank kids, rank teachers, rank schools, as if ranking were a strategy. Right? Be like you going to the doctor and going in for a checkup. The doctor says, ooh, high cholesterol, ooh, high blood pressure, ooh, you're sick. Say, okay, what's next, doctor? Say, that's all we do here. We just rank you. You are a very sick person. That's not good enough. We want someone who's actually going to help us with the next step. Okay, what do we do to get better? Right? The state of New York doesn't help you get better. It just tells you you're sick. Right? Bold approach says, no, we're going to use assessment to diagnose learning needs. We're going to use assessment as a tool, not as a weapon. We're going to use assessment to give students, parents, and teachers feedback on what we need to do more of or less of, or for this student to help that student to learn. We need assessment, but we need to use it properly. Now our approach says we got to get teacher-proof curriculum, teacher-proof strategy, because the problem is the teachers. If we can just fire the bad teachers, right? This is Michelle Reed had her way, just fire the bad teachers. She can't tell you who a bad teacher is, though. Bold approach says, no, we're going to build the capacity of teachers. And yeah, there are some teachers who shouldn't be teaching. And we're going to try to help them find something else to do. Because the fact of the matter is, if we truly understand that teaching is art and skill, if we appreciate that it's intellectual work, then yeah, not everyone can do this kind of work. But we have lots of people who get better over time if provided with support and provided with clear guidance on what good teaching looks like. And that's what's happening in these schools like Brockton and PS 28 and many others I could name. The narrow approach focuses on fad reforms of the kinds I've mentioned already, high-stakes testing, standards. Bold approach says we've got to focus on the whole child, all their needs. Narrow approach wants to hold principals and teachers accountable based on test scores. Bold approach says hold everyone accountable. Parents, kids, governors, hold them accountable too. Right? State legislature. All stakeholders should be accountable for what they bring to this process. That's part of the problem right now, is we want to hold those with the least power accountable, while those with the most power get off scot-free. Now our approach wants to treat parents as consumers. If they don't like what they get, leave. Bold approach says, no, treat parents as partners. Build real partnerships based on reciprocity between home and school. Treat low-income parents the way we treat affluent parents. Go to an affluent district and ask the educators, who are you accountable to? They'll tell you. It's the parents, not the board, not the superintendent, but the parents. Why? Because the parents let them know. We pay the taxes. If we're not happy, we're going to let you know. They feel entitled. We need to change the way in which schools in low-income communities work with the parents and communities they serve. The narrow approach uses discipline in a punitive manner to weed out the bad kids. That's why suspension rates are so high. The bold approach focuses on character, focuses on connecting kids to school, focuses on making sure that the underlying issues that drive behavior problems are being addressed. Now our approach says expand charter schools, and I have nothing against charter schools if they're good and if they're serving all children. Bold approach says, you know what, we've got to make sure we expand learning opportunities for all kids, regardless of what kind of school they're in. We've got to use schools to break the cycle of poverty. That's got to be the goal. Right? That's the goal. Talk about closing the achievement gap. What we should be trying to do is create schools where a child's race and class do not predict outcomes. Some of us have the great fortune of having attended schools like that. I did. Even though my family was from Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and even though neither of my parents graduated from high school, my parents managed to send all 6 of us to college. But my parents were immigrant parents. And like many immigrant parents, they made a mistake, at least initially. That was, they just trusted the schools and sent us off. And I remember when we moved from Brooklyn to Long Island, they put both my brother and I in special education. Because they looked at our names and said, Spanish surname means can't speak English, means a disability. So I was too little to know any better. I'm just playing along with the game, but my older brother says, something is wrong here. And he goes to my father and says, they got us in the wrong class. I'm not doing any work. My father, being the immigrant parent, says, you just behave yourself and do your work. Comes back the second day, still not doing any work. My father says, I'm getting tired of this. You better do your work. Third day, he shows a picture. He said, what's that? He said, that's all I did. So now my father's pissed. He says, okay, I'm coming to school. My father was a New York City police officer. He decided I better come in uniform. When he gets there, they try to assure him everything's okay, no problem. He says, no, I want to see. I want to see what's going on. And they take him to see, and he sees that nobody's being served because this is just a holding tank for children that they don't believe can learn. So we insist that his children be removed. They say, no, they've got to be tested first. So we take the test, and it turns out we can, in fact, read and write in English. And we place gifted and are moved. That older brother ends up going to Harvard. I end up going to Brown. How many of our kids right now are languishing in schools where their needs aren't being met, where parents aren't engaged, and no one is actively looking at whether or not their needs are being met? Here's the thing. The policymakers may be wrong about the types of reforms that are needed. They're not wrong about the fact that change is needed. We have far too many kids out there who are not getting an education that prepare them for life. It's not good enough to criticize. We've also got to suggest what should be different. How could it be different? And if we don't do that, then we make ourselves irrelevant to this discussion about change and about what needs to be done to improve our schools. We've got resources in this country that should be tapped. One of the primary resources are our universities. Our universities should be partners to school systems. How is it possible the United States has one of the best systems of higher education in the world and mediocre schools? It's all about the lack of connection. Right? And I don't just mean between schools of education and schools, I mean between the entire university and its resources. We need to be much more creative about how we build partnerships to support our schools, about how we engage teachers, how we engage families and communities, and how we engage children themselves, because until we do those kinds of things, we're not going to see outcomes for kids change. Not in a systematic way. We'll see isolated examples like Brockton and PS28, but we won't see across-the-board changes. For that to happen, we're going to need a systemic approach. And it's also going to mean we have to start asking very, very different kinds of questions. Instead of asking how to raise achievement, you know what we should ask? How to get kids excited about learning. Think about that question. I posed that question to a group of teachers recently, and they said, wow, no one ever asked me that before. And I said, well, what does it make you think? It says, well, it makes me think about what got me excited as a learner myself. When kids get excited about learning, they become willing participants in their own education. We start to tap into their intellectual curiosity. How many of you have met kids who have memorized the lyrics to hundreds of songs, but can't seem to remember anything they've learned in school? It's not about the capacity to learn, it's about our ability to make connections between things that matter for those children and what we have to teach them. I was visiting a school in Baltimore this past spring where they've decided to use science, because science is typically the favorite subject of children in elementary school, as the strategy for developing their literacy skills. And in a second grade classroom, the teachers decided to bring in a hermit crab. Well, she's got everybody's attention because the kids have never seen a hermit crab, and they got lots of questions. They want to know, what's he eat? Does he have children? What's his name? How do you get that house anyway? And after asking all those questions, now they are not just ready to write, they're excited about writing about that crab. All of us have had teachers, hopefully, at one point in our education, that got us to learn something we thought we didn't want to learn, or something we thought we weren't good at. We've got to show our educators what good teaching is, how to bring classrooms to life, how to bring the material to life so children will want to learn that material. And we've got to create schools that are so compelling that our children would rather be there than anywhere else. I work with a school like that right now in the Bronx called Eagle Academy. Eagle Academy is a school for young men. It was developed by David Banks because he said, I've got to create a school where the culture of the school is more powerful than the culture of the streets. Because they were losing too many young men to gangs, to prison, to early death. Now, the first time I ran into young men from Eagle Academy was on the subway. And anybody who takes the subway in New York City knows the worst time to take the subway is when school lets out. Because that's when it's going to be loud. That's when it's going to be chaotic. And you can avoid it, I suggest you do. But I was there, headed uptown. And there's a lot of kids, a lot of pushing and shoving. But I see 3 young men in ties. I see one of them offer his seat to a pregnant woman on the train. First, I thought they were Mormons, because we often have Mormons in the area. They said, no, we're not Mormons. They said they were coming from a field trip to the Museum of Natural History. I said, well, where's your teacher? They said, we take the subway every day. We know how to get home. I said, well, who taught you to offer up your seat? Where'd you get that from? They said, well, that's the Eagle way. That's the Eagle way. Lawrence Kohlberg once said, the goal of discipline is not to teach kids to avoid punishment. It's to teach kids to do what's right even when we're not looking. So I'm curious about Eagle Academy, how they taught these kids to do what's right even when there are no adults around. So I go to Eagle Academy and I learned that their strategy to make the school more compelling than the streets is to create a prep school for these young men in the South Bronx. And it's interesting because the school is located right next to the courthouse where young men are being arrested and sent away every day. And at this prep school for young men, there's robotics, there's chess, there's a whole range of electives. There's Latin, fencing, rugby. I said, why rugby? They said, the prep schools do it, we do it too. David said his strategy for countering the effects of gangs is to keep his kids so busy they don't have time for gangs. And it's working. I saw it working at the US First competition a year ago. US First is that robotics competition where kids come from all over the region to the Javits Center in New York City to compete with their robots. It's loud. I'm a judge. I know nothing about robots. But there I am. And I find out the young men from Eagle Academy have come in 6th place. That's 6 out of 80 teams. So I go to give them the news. They start jumping up and down and cheering. I say, well, that's good, but guess what? You don't get to go to the Georgia Dome for the finals because only the top 3 teams get to go. Who are they? Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, Brooklyn Tech. I said, but 6th place is pretty good. They say, yeah, we think it's real good. I said, I do too. I said, explain to me how you built the robot. So one kid takes out his notes. It's got formulas on it. He starts explaining to me the physics behind the robot. I don't understand anything he's talking about. I said, well, that's very impressive. I said, who helped you build the robot? They said, well, the first person to help us was our custodian. I said, the custodian helped you build a robot? They said, that's right, he got us the parts. We don't know where he gets the parts from, but whenever we need something for this robot, he comes through. I said, who else helped you build the robot? They said, well, our science teacher, there he is. And he's sleeping in a chair. I said, wow, he seems out of it. And he gets up, he said, that's because I was up till 3 in the morning with these kids. I said, you guys were up till 3 in the morning? They all shake their heads. He said, these kids have been working Saturdays, they've been working evenings for the last 3 months on this robot. I said, you guys work Saturdays and evenings? They all shook their heads. I said, you get paid? Nobody gets paid. I said, okay, so you came in 6th place. What's next? What do you guys want to do next? And every single one of these young men said they want to be mechanical engineers. Now, what's interesting about that is these are young men who come from neighborhoods where there are no mechanical engineers. It's hard to aspire to something you've never seen, isn't it? But they think they can because they were a part of something that allowed them not just to dream, but to imagine that they could do something very different. That's the power of education. That's what we've got to keep reminding ourselves, that knowledge is power, that education can, in fact, be a way to transform lives, and if we work at it, to even transform communities. But it's not easy. There's no shortcuts here. So the real challenge, I would say, to Buffalo, the real challenge to America today is, are we willing to do the hard work of embracing our schools, of providing the children with that kind of knowledge and education that will make them want to keep coming back, and tackling the tough issues they face, particularly in our poorest communities? Are we willing to do that work and stop the pointing of fingers and stop the slogans that mean nothing, and really do what it takes? Because the fact of the matter is, the future of this country will be determined by its schools. It's that important. We've got over 2 million people in this country who are incarcerated. And even now, as the recession is on, those numbers are still very, very high. I work with young men at Rikers Island, where we have 18 schools. And who do we incarcerate? Those we don't educate. There is a consequence for failure. And the consequence is being borne not just by those who fail in our schools and their families, but by our entire country. We can't afford to have so many people who are uneducated and who are unable to contribute. And particularly those of you who think about retirement, who are worried that your Social Security might be in jeopardy, then you should be the strongest advocates for good public education, because it is these children who will be supporting us in our retirement. So we need to realize that we are interconnected. Our fates are tied together. And addressing this problem is too important to leave it to our politicians. We can't wait for them to lead us. We can't wait for them to save our schools. We've got to do the work ourselves, and do it now, because too much is at stake. Thank you.